Dead by Daylight is far and away a game that focuses on gameplay above all else. But that is not to say that there is no story here. In fact, the story setting very neatly explains away the mechanics of the game in a way which makes the experience more immersive. A large amount of the story is told through the journal entries of a man named Benedict Baker. In 1956, Benedict Baker investigates the town of Weeks, a town in America where there were over 300 missing people reports, but not one body found. He concludes that all of the answers lead back to Macmillan Estate, the estate which Evan Macmillan, the trapper, grew up in. Baker begins to travel to the estate on foot, but ends up in a strange place, unsure of the date, time, or location. The realm that he describes is an otherworldly plane of existence from which there is no escape. He tells us of an evil incarnate, an entity, and of this he states, "The entity reaches out to pluck those who fall into its path, bringing them to its hideous construct, where it plays with their soul for all eternity. The entity curses those innocents with an endless game of life and death. Each death brings an awakening into a fresh hell, where the hunt begins again." This world that Baker is drawn into is the world where we face our trials, a never-ending game of cat and mouse, so that the entity can feed off the hope and fears of the victims. When you sacrifice a victim in the gameplay, you are sacrificing a victim to the entity, who will then feed off their soul. Baker describes this realm as the place between worlds, a parallel world if you like. The rules are different in this realm. Baker tells us that you feel pain and you can die, but you cannot escape, for you come back again and again. This neatly explains the gameplay. You can play as your survivor, your favourite survivor, in multiple trials, even if they were sacrificed in the previous game. The entity has trapped them here, so that it can endlessly feed off your death. Baker explains the purpose of this. No sense of purpose other than to endlessly torture its victims over and over again. It is torture and not death it seeks, as there is always an escape. Perhaps it feeds off our hope, as it seems to offer us, before dashing it cruelly at the last second. These games that we play are devised and created by the entity. Those people who disappeared in Weeks and other places across the globe are the survivors in-game, those chosen by the entity to be tortured for eternity. The entity wants us to feel hope, and so, if you have ever wondered why the entity will allow us a way to escape, it is the desire to instill in us a chance of hope or escape before the killer dashes these hopes and hangs us from a hook. In fact, Baker even goes as far to suggest that the entity is a parasite which actually needs to feed on hope to sustain itself to survive, much as we survive on food and water. The entity is an otherworldly creature that is beyond our comprehension. Whether it is alien or just a creature of pure evil, it is hard to say. It has the power to create parallel worlds which obey its rules and draw victims and killers to it from the real world. It doesn't seem to exist in one physical space, and in general is hard to understand. Baker writes this of the entity: "This thing that I dubbed the entity is evil in its purest form. I find it hard to spot, but I can hear the cracking sound of this loathsome thing emanates, like a deity. It surrounds the area, closing in on me as its killers hunt me. Once on the hook, the entity takes over, pulling one upwards to something else." We too can hear these cracks as the claws of the entity dig into the victim. Spindle spider-like legs are all we see of it, and it takes its victim somewhere else. Upwards, we see a soul of the person, the victim, being pulled towards the sky. The entity manifests at will when it is time to feed on the suffering, and it is up to its pawns, the killers, to do the dirty work. The killers are chosen for their violence, to play their part in feeding the entity, and are drawn to this place between worlds. One needs only look at the biographies of the killers to understand why these beings were chosen to do the bidding of the entity. Evan McMillan, the trapper, has close ties to the backstory of Baker because Baker and the other people missing from Weeks were taken from McMillan's estate. Both a killer and survivor, therefore, are taken from the same location. It is possible, although this is my speculation, that the entity draws and picks its victims from violent flashpoints, places where great violence has taken place. This theory is backed up by Baker's journal, for after studying the disappearances in Weeks, he determines that this rot, the missing people, took hold after a number of people's deaths occurs. These deaths most likely being at the hand of Evan McMillan after he collapsed the mine on the McMillan estate. The trial arenas we have our games in seem to be twisted reflections of the real world. There is McMillan estate maps. There is a map in Otto Haven Wreckers where the Wraith slaughtered Azarov, and there is the Thompson farm and homestead where the hillbilly slaughtered his family. It seems then that the entity draws on these points in the real world, warping the real locations for the trials and pulling both killers and victims from these locations. The killers are controlled by the entity, and it is the reason we usually do not kill the survivors ourselves. We have to offer them to the entity. It is also possible that the entity affected them in the first place and made them killers to create this great violence that would allow it to have a grasp on our real world, but that's speculation. Baker tells us that after each trial, or match, the survivors are returned to the campfire, the menu, a fire that burns eternally, and this adds some nice context to the menu screen. What this tells us is that we are all trapped, killers and survivors alike, in a parallel plane of existence, to play our part in satiating the entity. This world, it rules as a deity, and we must all follow its rules. As such, the rules are different here, and these features help tidy up the story and explain gameplay implications. It explains why the trials take place in a set arena. It explains why the survivors can survive horrific injuries. It explains how survivors survive trial to trial. And it explains why the killers do not usually kill you by their own hand. This is all a game for the entity, and in such, it explains why we play the game the way it is. So thanks for that, guys. I hope you enjoyed my little summary of the setting and the story behind the game. It's a fantastic game, and I just wanted to kind of add some depth and immersion to it. Please comment and subscribe if you want more. Thanks.